Isaiah Coleman used to say a man could smell his own dirt from a mile away. He said it the way other men said a prayer, quiet, certain, like it was something he'd earned the right to believe. And in the fall of 1921, on 40 acres just outside a small Oklahoma town, that dirt belonged to him. He'd bought it with his own hands, not given, not gifted, bought, dollar by dollar, season by season, starting the year after his mother was freed from a life she never chose. He used to tell his daughter Ruth that freedom without land was just a word, a pretty word, maybe, but a word you couldn't feed a family with. Ruth was 12 that year. She remembered the smell of turned soil in the morning, her father's boots by the door, still wet from the fields before the sun had even climbed all the way up. She remembered her mother humming while she worked, not because life was easy, but because for the first time in that family's memory, it was theirs. They grew cotton. They grew corn. They grew something else, too. Something harder to name. Pride. Maybe. Or hope. The kind that made Isaiah stand a little taller when he walked past the general store. The kind that made some of his white neighbors look at him a little too long. Because a black man doing well in 1921 wasn't just unusual. To some folks, it was an insult. There was a banker in town, a man named Whitfield, who'd taken notice of the Coleman land. Rich soil. Good water, a location that, if it belonged to the right kind of family, could be worth 10 times what it was. He'd come around twice that year, hat in his hands, smile stretched too wide, offering to buy the land for a fraction of its worth. Isaiah refused both times. Politely, firmly, the way a man refuses something he built with his own sweat. What Isaiah didn't know was that refusal, coming from a black man, was rarely allowed to be the final word. There were other signs too, small ones, easy to miss if you weren't looking. A neighbor who stopped waving. A shopkeeper who suddenly needed cash instead of credit. A sheriff's deputy who drove past the Coleman farm slower than he used to, like he was counting something. Ruth noticed her father's jaw tightening more often that autumn. She noticed her mother praying a little longer before bed. Still, life went on the way life does when you choose not to look directly at the storm gathering on the horizon. There was a harvest to bring in. There was Sunday dinner and laughter around a table too small for how much love sat at it. There was a little girl learning to read by lamplight, her father's calloused finger tracing the words beside hers, telling her that this land, this house, this name, was going to be hers one day, that it was going to outlive him. He believed that with his whole chest. Then, on a cold morning in November, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't neighborly. It wasn't the tired shuffle of a friend stopping by for coffee. It was hard, deliberate, 3 knocks meant to announce power before a single word was spoken. Ruth would remember that sound for the rest of her life. Not because of what was said that morning, but because of what came after it. Because standing on the other side of that door were men who carried papers instead of guns. And in 1921, papers could do just as much damage. Isaiah opened the door with the same steady hands that had built everything behind him. He had no way of knowing that in the coming days, those hands would be forced to sign away everything they had ever worked for. He only knew, standing there in the doorway, that something in the wind had changed. And it had. The men at the door introduced themselves as representatives of the county. They didn't ask to come in. They walked past Isaiah like the house wasn't his to guard, like the invitation had already been decided somewhere else, in some other room, by men who had never once set foot on Coleman land. They laid papers on the kitchen table. Papers with words too small and too tangled for a man who'd spent his life reading soil instead of statutes. They told him there was a lien on the property, a debt he supposedly owed, a debt he had never signed for, never agreed to, never even heard of until that morning. Isaiah asked to see proof. He asked calmly, the way he always spoke, because he still believed, in that moment, that reason would matter. That truth still counted for something in a country that had written his freedom into its laws. The men didn't answer his question. They repeated theirs instead. Would he sign the papers, or would the sheriff be called to settle the matter? Ruth stood in the doorway of the next room, 12 years old, watching her father's hands go still on the table. She had never seen her father's hands still like that before. Those hands had built fences, pulled calves into the world, held her through fevers. Now they hovered over a piece of paper meant to erase everything they'd built. He asked for time. A day, an hour, even, to speak with a lawyer. They told him there was no time. They told him the sheriff was already on his way, as if that were a kindness, as if giving a man advance warning of his own robbery was some form of mercy. What Isaiah didn't know, what he wouldn't learn until years later, was that banker Whitfield had filed those very papers himself. A forged debt, a manufactured lien, stitched together in a back office by men who understood that a black man's word would never outweigh a white man's signature in that courthouse. It wasn't robbery in the way the law would ever call it. It was simply paperwork. Quiet, bloodless, and devastating. Isaiah signed. He signed because the alternative was worse, because refusing meant arrest on invented charges, and arrest for a black man in Oklahoma in 1921 could mean disappearing altogether. He signed because his family was standing in the next room, and a dead man protects no one. His hand shook the whole time. Ruth remembered that shake more than she remembered the words on the page. She remembered thinking her father was the strongest man in the world, and watching that strength bend under the weight of something that wasn't even real. Within the week, they were told to leave. Not asked. Told. The land that had fed them, sheltered them, given them a name to be proud of, was no longer theirs to stand on. They packed what could fit onto a borrowed wagon. Ruth's mother folded dresses with trembling hands, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't break her. Isaiah stood in the doorway one last time, looking out at the fields he had turned with his own back, at the house he had built board by board, and he said only one sentence before they pulled away. He said, "Remember this ground. It still knows us." Ruth didn't understand what he meant. Not then. She only understood the shame of it, the way former neighbors watched from their porches as the Coleman wagon rolled past, some with pity in their eyes, some with something closer to satisfaction. She understood the silence that followed them down that road, a silence heavier than any words could have been. What made it worse wasn't just the loss. It was the knowing. Knowing that Whitfield would take that land and multiply its worth. Knowing that the same courthouse that erased their ownership in an afternoon would never spend a single hour investigating how it happened. Knowing that there would be no trial, no arrest, no reckoning. Just a family walking away from everything they had built, and a system that would call it lawful. Isaiah never spoke of that morning again. Not because he forgot, but because some wounds don't heal by talking. They heal, if they heal at all, by surviving long enough to be remembered by someone else. And though he didn't know it yet, that job would fall to his daughter, and to the daughter who would come after her. The Colemans settled 20 miles away, in a small rented house on the edge of another town that wasn't quite theirs either. Isaiah worked other men's land after that. He never owned soil again. Something in him closed that day at the kitchen table, quiet but permanent, like a door that still hung on its hinges, but never fully opened the same way twice. Ruth grew up watching her father work fields that would never belong to him, and she never forgot the sentence he said the day they left. "Remember this ground. It still knows us." She didn't understand it as a child. She understood it as a grown woman, holding an old leather Bible in her hands, the one her father kept his whole life, its spine cracked from handling, its pages soft with age. Inside that Bible, tucked between the book of Psalms and the book of Proverbs, was the original deed. Isaiah had kept a copy, hidden folded so many times the creases had nearly worn through the paper. He never told anyone he still had it. Not until the last months of his life, lying in a bed too small for the size of what he'd carried, when he called Ruth close and told her where to find it. He didn't ask her to fight. He was too tired for anger by then, too worn down by decades of swallowing something that never fully went down. He only asked her to remember. He said that land was still theirs in every way that mattered, even if the law said otherwise, and that someday someone in the family might have the strength, or the standing, or the sheer stubbornness to make the law agree. Ruth carried that Bible for the rest of her life. She carried the story too, though not loudly. She wasn't the kind of woman who spoke of pain in front of company. She told it in pieces, at kitchen tables, during long car rides, in the quiet hour after Sunday dinner, when the dishes were done, and the children were tired enough to listen without complaint. That's how her granddaughter Ada first heard it. Not as a lesson, not as a lecture, but as a story told low and steady, the kind of story that settles into a child's chest and stays there long after the words are forgotten. Ada remembered the shake in her grandmother's voice more than the details. She remembered the way Ruth's hands moved when she talked about that morning, like she was still trying to hold something back from falling. The Coleman family never fully recovered what was taken. Not the wealth that land would have built. Not the generations of stability that come from owning something outright in a country that so rarely allowed it. There were harder Christmases because of it. There were dreams deferred, children who couldn't attend the schools their grandparents once imagined, opportunities that closed quietly, without explanation, the way opportunities so often did for families like theirs. But there was also this, a little girl who grew up asking questions no one wanted to answer, who studied harder than she needed to, who chose law not because it was easy, but because somewhere inside her, she carried a promise she didn't fully understand yet. Ada didn't know the details of land records or fraudulent liens when she was young. She only knew that something had been stolen from her family, and that the theft had never been punished. She carried her grandmother's story into law school. She carried it into her first job, and her second, through years of quiet, unglamorous work that rarely made headlines. And somewhere in the back of a filing cabinet, decades after Isaiah Coleman signed his name to papers he never understood, his great-granddaughter began asking the one question no one in that family had ever been allowed to ask out loud. What if we could get it back? It took Ada almost 6 years to build the case. Not 6 years of dramatic courtroom battles, but 6 years of the slow, unglamorous work that real justice actually requires. Land records buried in county archives, handwriting samples compared line by line, letters between long-dead bank officials that had somehow survived in a historical society's basement, waiting for someone who cared enough to look. She wasn't alone in it. She found others doing the same work in other states, researchers and lawyers and descendants who had grown up hearing their own version of Ruth's story. Different names, different towns, the same theft dressed up in different paperwork. Black families across the country who had lost land the same way the Colemans had, through forged debts, manufactured liens, courthouses that never once questioned a white man's signature. The deed her great-grandfather kept folded inside his Bible became the thread that pulled the whole case together. It matched, line for line, the original county filing before it had been altered. It proved what Isaiah Coleman had known in his bones the morning he signed those papers with shaking hands, that the debt was never real, that the land had been taken, not sold. The legal process was slow and cold, in the way institutions usually are, unmoved by grief, unimpressed by history, demanding proof instead of pain. Ada gave it proof. Years of proof. And when the case finally reached a hearing, she stood in a room that her great-grandfather would never have been allowed to speak in, holding paperwork he had hidden in scripture, because he had nowhere safer to put the truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply laid the timeline out, plainly, the same way her grandmother once told it at a kitchen table, low and steady, insisting on being heard. The ruling didn't undo history. Nothing could give Isaiah Coleman back the years he spent working land that never became his again. Nothing could return the Christmases that came up short, the schooling that never happened, the version of the Coleman family that might have existed if that morning in 1921 had never come. But it did something else. It said, on the record, in writing, in a courthouse that had once erased them without a second thought, that what happened to that family was wrong, that the land had been stolen, that the truth, buried for over 100 years, was still true. Part of the original Coleman land was returned to the family. Not all of it. Time and development had changed too much for that, but enough of it. Enough soil. Enough of that same ground Isaiah once told his daughter to remember, that Ada could stand on it and feel something her ancestors had been forced to leave behind. She brought her grandmother's Bible with her the first time she walked that field. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She just stood there, the way her great-grandfather once stood in that doorway, looking out over land that finally, after 100 years, knew its own family again. Somewhere, a young girl not so different from Ruth might hear this story one day, at a kitchen table, told low and steady by someone who lived close enough to the pain to still feel its weight. And maybe she'll carry it the same way. Not as bitterness, but as proof that memory, patience, and truth can outlast even the coldest kind of injustice. That's the story of the Coleman family, a story about land, but really, a story about what it means to hold on to truth when the whole world tells you to let it go. My name is Simmons, and this has been Chronicles of Black. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments which part stayed with you the longest. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, remembered, and passed on, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more waiting to be shared. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering with me.